If you're studying the AQA A-level syllabus, you'll have a whole section of your course about Baroque solo concertos. And if you are following the Edexcel GCSE syllabus, you'll be looking in depth at instrumental music from 1700 to 1820. With this in mind, I've chosen to share a viola concerto with you. I'll make a couple of comparisons to things I think you might already know, but hopefully I'll also explain it well enough that you'll be able to understand and apply the information to any of the myriad pathways you might be on. First up, let's talk about who Telemann was. George Philip Telemann was born in 1681 and died in 1767. That means he was alive for 86 years. To put that in context, he was born before Bach was, and by the time he died, Haydn was a 32-year-old man with an established composing career, and Mozart had written his first operas. This long lifespan is one of the reasons he was so famous in his day. He had the time, but also he used his time well. He was good at self-promotion and understood the opportunities presented by the explosion in popularity of music printing and distribution in the early 18th century. It's estimated that Telemann wrote about 125 concertos. Only one of these was for viola, but it's probably his most famous concerto and gets performed regularly today, 300 years later. It's also the first viola concerto to have been written, so in the context of viola repertoire it's very important. It's hard to find an exact date that Telemann wrote the viola concerto, although we're fairly sure that it was written whilst Telemann was working in Frankfurt and that it would have been performed publicly as part of a subscription series of concerts in the city. That puts it between 1716 and 1721. If you're studying the AQA A-level, for context, this is almost the same time as Bach's A minor violin concerto and 10 to 15 years before Vivaldi's flute concerto. Telemann's viola concerto is in 4 movements: largo, allegro, andante and presto, or slow, fast, slow, fast. This is the same form as church sonatas, but different from the 2 other concertos I just mentioned because they both follow the modern standard of 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. That said, the key structure of the Telemann is major, major, relative minor, major, so it's not too dissimilar from the Bach and the Vivaldi. As a side note, Bach is definitely more famous than Telemann today, but during their lifetimes it was the other way around. Telemann was considerably more famous and had a better job. They definitely knew each other, and Telemann is godfather to C.P.E. Bach, J.S.'s son. The second movement of Telemann's viola concerto is on the Grade 6 ABRSM syllabus, so I'm going to take this opportunity to discuss some of the ways that you might practice this, as well as some of the techniques that Telemann uses that you might want to emulate if you're writing a viola part as part of your composition module. Before you start practicing this piece, it's worth reminding yourself of G major 2 octaves and having a little noodle around the scale and arpeggio, because they're used a lot to build the melody, so having a hand-shaped set will save you a lot of time in decision making. The movement starts with this lovely phrase, which is essentially an arpeggio attached to a scale. It's played by the orchestra, then the soloist, then the orchestra, and then the 4th time the soloist plays it and introduces this idea of sevenths. Notice the syncopation in the melody. These sevenths are a lovely feeling on the viola. They sound quite fancy because there are a lot of notes, but they're relatively simple to play because you can keep your left hand fingers down and then it's just a bowing pattern. Telemann uses this idea quite a few times through the movement, building it into a longer sequence towards the end. The third phrase, Telemann uses that syncopation again, but instead of the pitch going down at the end, he keeps it high and leads us on to D major, our dominant key. We then play the original theme in D. A really lovely thing about string instruments is that because they're tuned in perfect fifths, if you notice you're playing the same tune but on a different string, you've almost definitely made that tonic dominant switch. So it's a great clue. In bar 33, we have a series of arpeggios. We play them twice in each bar as echoes and then finish the phrase with the same idea of broken sixths that we just heard. Another nice thing about harmony in string instruments is that the more you play, the more you'll notice how intervals fit onto the instrument as handshakes. So here I'm using pairs of consecutive fingers, 3 and 4, 2 and 3, 1 and 2, with my lower number finger on the lower string, and I know it's sixths. I've got my 3 and my 4, 2 and my 3, 1 and 2, open and 1. So I can think of them. Then, if I want to know if it's a major or minor sixth, I just need to notice if my fingers are touching or not. At E, we have a couple more arpeggios, and then we start with our original melody, the theme. Notice how Telemann changes direction on the D, our dominant, to set up this longer sequence of suspensions. When I'm playing this, I'm approaching it the same way as the sevenths earlier in the piece, and I'm keeping my fingers down while my bow does all the hard work. If you're composing a theme and variations, this is a really fun way to add rhythmic variation to a repeated harmony that gives quite a virtuosic effect. It really suits string instruments. Just be careful that the notes you've chosen fit within your hand and are on consecutive strings. Sixths are great, but anything less than an octave usually works, and if you're not sure, ask a friend or a teacher. Now notice how the syncopation came back at the end of that phrase. It's nice and jolly, and you can draw attention to it as a performer by exaggerating the articulation and keeping it quite separated. The next entry is a lovely flourish. Anything that moves by step is generally easy to play on an instrument, especially if it's in a key which suits the instrument. Here Telemann is using a G major scale and climbing an octave, then dropping a fifth. He's made it sound even more exciting by starting it off the beat, so you get this sense of urgency and excitement until you reach the sevenths from earlier. He then repeats the idea, but starting up a string, which you'll remember means up a fifth. This time, the seventh figure resolves into a series of arpeggios, and at this point we're getting near to the end of the movement, and Telemann is going for a big finish. One of the ways that Telemann is building excitement is by having the arpeggios succeed the scales. He's given them a good introduction, and the other way, compared to the first time we heard the figure, is that these arpeggios are higher on the instrument, they're the top two strings instead of the bottom two strings, and they're shaped to emphasise the melodic rise rather than the melodic fall, and the phrase as a whole climbs. What I mean by that is the first version goes down, and the second version goes up. He rounds off the solo contribution with one more statement of the wide intervals and the syncopation. It's really tempting if you're playing this alone to slow down because that's one of the ways we indicate the music is ending. But remember, just because your solo line is ending doesn't mean the music is ending. And the orchestra or piano have another 7 bars of music. So keep the tempo, otherwise it's really hard to make the transition and the real ending convincing.